Okay, hello everyone. Joining me here, Elliot Grigg from Eat Sleep Boxing Repeat. Joining me with Paul Kelly and Gregory Doyle, as we're here to bring you a special breakdown, which I believe is going to be titled something along the lines of "Worst Scorecards Ever." So first off, chaps, just like to say thank you for joining me here, and hope you're both well. How are things?
Thanks for having us, mate. All good.
All good.
So if we look at, obviously there's been a bit of contention around recent fights here and there. I mean, if we take some that have actually affected the decision, I mean, I don't want to go on about it. We've talked about it previously before, but obviously the Taylor Catchwell decision, the split decision victory for Taylor there, in a fight that a lot of people suggested he lost. But also other fights where you look at it, like Martin McCauley obviously went to Paris, fought Tony Yoka recently. One judge gave that a draw in a 10-rounder where you could generously probably give Yoka 2 rounds. And then if you look at boxing as a whole, obviously with Canelo Bivol recently, it didn't affect the decision, but people beforehand were going, Cinco de Mayo versus Canelo in America. Bivol's probably going to have to win 13 rounds, drop Canelo, render him a vegetable before he even gets a draw. So I think it's almost like an intrinsic problem that boxing has. But as Greg, I know you said this before, as a student of the game, is that it's not just a sense of this sort of presentism, like, we're focusing on like Taylor and Catchwell, but obviously this sort of thing's been going on for a long time. And there's been a lot of decisions that are even worse than necessarily than that one. One you like to talk about as well is obviously Roy Jones Jr. 1988 final Olympics in Seoul. But what we're going to do today is we're going to pick one each fight from any sort of era or any sort of age, whichever we prefer, and we're going to just sort of talk through it briefly. Everyone's going to give their outline of the fight and their selection, and then there'll be a few questions, and then we'll go from there. So hope you guys enjoy this, and we're going to do it in date order. So we haven't pre-planned this necessarily, but I do know the dates of the fights, so in order to get the order. And we're going to go to Paul Kelly first. Paul Kelly, would you like to talk us through your choice, please?
Yes, thanks very much for that, Elliot. Great intro. Yes, so despite the fact that I am the youngest of the three of us here, by quite some distance, but don't hit me for that. But yeah, and I was actually only one when this fight took place. So I wish I could say that I stayed up all night to watch it, whatever. But I obviously didn't. I've just seen it. I've seen it on repeat. I've seen it on repeat on tapes numerous times, and it's one of those fights that it does get mentioned. I think it's fair to say as a really bad decision. We talked about we could have gone on for, you could have named 10 each almost, and we'll probably come out of this thinking, oh, I wish I had said that. But the one I have picked is Lennox Lewis versus Evander Holyfield, their first fight in 1999, and it was ruled a split decision draw. So Holyfield wasn't given the decision against Lewis. So you might think that, oh, well, what's the matter with that? It was a draw. They had a rematch and Lewis did win. But if you actually look at the fight, it's ridiculous how that was given a draw. Just to read out the scorecards, it was one judge had it 116, 113 in favour of Lewis. One judge had it 115 even, and another judge had it 115, 113 in favour of Holyfield. So that judge is saying that Evander Holyfield won 7 rounds, which is absolute madness. The whole fight. If you look at the whole fight, Lennox Lewis's jab could not miss that night. I'm sure you've seen it quite a few times as well. More or less every jab he threw landed right on the chin or on the nose, on the forehead, somewhere in the face of Evander Holyfield. And yeah, just Holyfield as well. As the fight progressed, he was getting desperate, and you could tell he was frustrated. Even Holyfield knew, he knew he was losing that fight. But yeah, it was just like, it was one of those ones where, I'm not saying it was, you can argue whether it was a prime Lewis or whatever, or whether it was before that or after, but if you look at that fight, just as that one fight in 1999, Holyfield couldn't miss with the jab. He didn't do anything wrong. He never looked in danger, and he did put a bit of a beat down on Evander Holyfield. Obviously, it comes to the decision. Lewis is happy days. I'm going to become undisputed champion, because obviously at that time the WBO wasn't really recognised as a major belt as it is now. So it was a kind of still the 3-belt era, and the WBC, WBA and IBF titles were on the line. And then obviously as the scorecards were read out, and he must have been thinking, what is going on here? Obviously you can say with Holyfield being American, and the fight was at Madison Square Garden, like you alluded to there, with a few hometown decisions that we've had in recent time. But yeah, no, I think without going completely into detail about round by round, I think that fight does stick out to me as one that I've watched several times since. Not when it was in the nappies or whatever, but no, I just think that was a ridiculous decision. And then obviously just touching on the fact that they did have a rematch. It was 7 months later, and Lewis did get the unanimous decision win. It wasn't in New York. It wasn't at MSG. It was over in Vegas. So it was still in America. And there was actually still a 115-113 card in favour of Lennox Lewis that night, which although it was a unanimous decision win, it was still a wee bit close. But the other two were a lot wider and more fair. So he did end up winning via unanimous decision against Holyfield in the rematch. He did end up winning the three belts, becoming undisputed champion. So yeah, I think that the first fight between Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield is certainly one that sticks out in my mind as being a ridiculous judging scorecard decision, whatever you want to call it.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. I think as you were talking through that, I looked at a couple of stats from that fight as well, and it said that Lennox Lewis out-jabbed Holyfield 137-52, and punch stats landed him 388 to 130. So I'm just going to say, Greg, obviously Paul there alluded to the fact that it's possibly the draw could possibly be a case of home advantage for Holyfield. Do you think that's the case, or do you think boxing in the condition that it was at that time, possibly more corrupt, possibly less corrupt? What do you think the reason was for that shocking decision that night, if there was one?
I think it's a bit of both, Elliot. Paul, that was a really good listen there, by the way. I was kind of hoping you wouldn't stop. I was like, where's this going next? I enjoyed that. I think it's and I think promotional companies, I think certain states or cities, etc., they'll favour certain fighters. I don't want to go into too much of like people's backgrounds or beliefs and things, but some of these things, they still take place in boxing. And I've got a really good example when we come to the fight that I want to talk about, but I agree with Paul. I watched that fight that night. Lennox Lewis jabbed his head off. It was, I mean, competitive, but competitive where you knew that Lewis was winning most of the rounds. But yeah, number of reasons, but promotional beliefs, etc., those kind of politics, they always come into it in boxing, don't they?
No, absolutely. And Paul, just to round off there then as well, do you think, I mean, you alluded to it there, but do you think, again, that result was a case simply of home advantage, or do you think there was anything in your, I mean, again, obviously, I'm not saying you've sat on any promoter's knee, been bouncing up and down and know the answer to it necessarily, but from the outside perspective, do you have any sort of further reflection as to why that result might have been so wrong?
Yeah, I think what Greg said there is true. You never really know what's going on. Boxing politics is so prominent, and we wish it wasn't. But yeah, you always have. You can always see with promotions who they want to win, almost. So they must, Holyfield. They probably thought in their heads before, right? Well, at worst, Holyfield's getting a draw here, which is what happened because they couldn't possibly have given the decision to Holyfield. I think as well. I think the thing that that interests me as well is if I know I've alluded to the rematch afterwards, but it didn't generate nearly as much hype because people, and normally a rematch would, but people knew exactly how the first fight went. They were just like, well, it's going to be more of the same, but Lewis will probably get the decision this time, which he did. So yeah, I think that it was clear to see that there was a little bit of jiggery pokery going on in the first fight.
And I thank you very much, Paul. That was a fantastic summary of that fight. Actually, and I've got I'm going to finish it with a small segue, which is that one of my middle initials is L, and I told everyone at school that was Lennox after the boxer Lennox Lewis, and only when our names were put down on the exam board and it was revealed that my name wasn't Lennox did I get a lot of shit for a few years after that. But anyway, so we've gone from there, and we're now going to go into 2009, when I believe, Paul, you would have been 11. Is that correct? 11 years old, and Gregory is going to take us through the second fight, the second controversial fight. Greg, please, if you'd like to announce what fight you're going to take us through and give us a quick summary. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, my friend. Might shock a few because of a few different fights that we could discuss, maybe a little bit more high profile, but one that always jumps out to me is the first meeting between Paulie Malignaggi and Juan Diaz. It took place, as you say, 2009 in Texas. It was a super lightweight contest, I believe. Guys, just terrible. If the subject that we are really here to discuss is the worst judges' scorecards, okay? So I will come to that. I went back and I watched the fight again yesterday. I believe I watched it. And again, I think I scored at like 116, 112 or 117, 111, excuse me, for Malignaggi. His boxing was beautiful that night. possibly the second or the third best performance of his career, behind the rematch and when he went to, I think it was either Russia or Ukraine, to beat Sinchenko for the WBA welterweight title. Boxed beautiful that night. Always say, guys, a little bit off record, but see if Paulie Malignaggi had a concussive punch, you're looking at like a 3 or 4 weight world champion, without a doubt. The guy's box ability was tremendous, but a lot of the fighters that he fought, they just knew that he didn't carry that main power. Although he punched hard enough, just not enough to merit enough respect. That night, if you go back and you watch the fight through the early stages, it was relatively close. Through 4 or 5, I think he maybe had Malignaggi up by 1. He used to throw beautiful combinations. Malignaggi used to throw a beautiful 1-2-3, which was a jab, right hand, and a jab. When you throw that shot, you always catch fighters off with it because they think you're going to leave it at the 1-2. But when that one, the third one comes in, snaps the head back. And yeah, guys, as the fight drew on, see the second half of the fight, Malignaggi just started to pull away a little bit. I think Harold Lederman at the time scored at 8, 9, 10 and 11 the rounds for Malignaggi. I think his overall scorecard was 115, 113. But this is the bit where it gets interesting. So Juan Diaz resided basically in Texas. The fight was in Texas. It was a golden boy show. Juan Diaz was a golden boy fighter. Gail Van Hoy, who was a judge that night, scored at 118, 110 for Juan Diaz. Absolutely corrupt. And the guy who was regarded as being Golden's boy's like back pocket judge, Raul Caiz Senior or Junior, I think there's 2 of them, isn't there? He actually had it the closest. He had it 115, 113 for Diaz. So it was just crazy. With it being in Texas, a golden boy show, you just knew that Malignaggi was going to have to do something special to get it that night. But I'm proud to say that the rematch did happen and Malignaggi absolutely stood him on his head, boxed rings round him again and got the decision this time. But guys, for me, that's one of the worst I've ever seen. That 118, 110 scorecard, it makes me want to be sick. It really does.
David, thank you very much. That was another fantastic summary of that fight, and I agree with you. It was cool. I didn't actually know the stuff that you've unpicked there about the judging, the Gold Boy controversy as well. So thank you very much for that. I've also I'm not going to come to you, Paul, actually, and ask you obviously why you think it happened because Greg has solved that crime for us. But what I am going to ask you is, as Greg actually alluded to there, is do you think in boxing circles that Paulie Malignaggi gets the respect that he deserves? I mean, if you look at his record, 36-8. I mean, like Greg said, fantastic technical boxer with losses, I suppose, against guys such as, Broner, Garcia, lost to Porter as well, I believe. But do you think, I mean, that was coming towards the end of his career, but do you think he has the respect he deserves, or do you think he's underappreciated in the boxing world?
No, I definitely don't think he gets the praise he really deserves. I think Greg will agree. I mean, obviously, if you look at his record, he ended up retiring with, I think it was 8 or so losses, but a lot of those did come at the end of his career when he perhaps should have called it a day a good bit earlier. But no, I think Malignaggi on his day, as Greg said, say if he did have a concussive punch, he was a nightmare for anyone between lightweight and even super welterweight. He would have given anyone nightmares. But coming to the end of his career, I think sometimes this is the problem with us, with the majority of boxing fans. You only really remember the last few fights of someone's career. There's been so many examples of people, coming to the end of their career. Like, for example, I'll use Amir Khan as an example. A lot of people probably think he probably won't get the respect he deserves just because in the latter stages of his career, he was just, after the Canelo fight, really, even before the Canelo fight, he just wasn't himself, and those losses. And I know Greg always said that he thought Kelbrook would have beaten Amir Khan, and he ended up doing so. But I don't think it would have been like that if it had been Prime versus Prime. Okay, Brook might have won, but just on that night, it was so clear to see Khan was passing. You can kind of draw similarities with Malignaggi, and you know which one? I'll just quickly mention this, because it really, really annoys me. Do you remember when Conor McGregor was fighting Floyd Mayweather, and he supposedly knocked Malignaggi down, and Malignaggi got so much abuse about those supposed pictures? I mean, we probably don't know what the real story is. There's McGregor's side, there's Malignaggi's side, and then there's the truth somewhere in the middle. But if you walk down the street and mention Paulie Malignaggi now, quite a lot of people will be like, oh, is he the guy that got beat up by Conor McGregor, who hadn't even had a professional boxing match? So that, in that sense, no, he doesn't get the respect he deserves at all, in my opinion.
No, I totally agree with you, Paul, actually. And I think it was a shame what happened, obviously, with the Conor McGregor promotion and what that happened there. And I'm actually going to give you the last word here, Greg, from that area. You know, obviously a fan of Malignaggi as well. And I was going to say, anything you can say in testament to Malignaggi? Do you agree with Paul that essentially he was underappreciated by boxing circles? And there's just any sort of final words on what a fighter he was?
Yeah, thanks, mate. Definitely underappreciated. People forget that Malignaggi's breakthrough was he gave Miguel Cotto at the time the hardest fight of his career. That's how Malignaggi came to be known. He was unknown, fought Miguel Cotto. Another guy that he's maybe forgot that he fought there is he pushed Ricky Hatton for 11 rounds. And then I think he was pulled out. He was behind in the fight. But that night, just to final touch point on it, the punches landed were fairly even, except Malignaggi had a little bit more. But see, that night, Malignaggi threw nearly 300 punches more than Juan Diaz that night. That's just crazy when you think on it. I know we score fights based on shots landed, but surely in some fights you've got to score it based on effort and who's pushing the fight and who's looking to win the fight. But yeah, I'll stop, me. I could go on all day about that fight, but yeah.
Right, that brings us to our final one, and unfortunately it now falls onto me to discuss my fight. But it's going to be, I've chosen this one, like to say, primarily because, like with Greg's fight, I was going to say with Greg's fight, because I couldn't actually understand why that had happened. In the sense, when I look at boxing, you think of money fighters. Why essentially would this upset happen to someone who was essentially at that time the money fight? So the scorecards were bad, but equally you could look at, like the Adelaide Bird card, for example, and go, that was terrible. But this was the one that influenced the decision. We're going back to 2012, and we're going Manny Pacquiao versus Tim Bradley. Now, obviously at that time, Pacquiao was in the ascendancy. There was a lot of talk of him fighting Mayweather. The negotiations for that fight fell through. I think that was time when Mayweather went to then fight Miguel Cotto, essentially because Cotto and Pacquiao couldn't agree a catch weight at that time. I think Pacquiao wanted it 147. Cotto essentially refused to go that low. So having essentially unified I think it was super lightweight the division, Bradley beat Lamont Penson, didn't he, and Devon Alexander. He moved up essentially to fight Manny Pacquiao rather than face Amir Khan. And essentially was built on the Pacquiao Marquez 3 fight, where Tim Bradley fought under there. But I mean, so he's moved up obviously in weight, but he was I think he was actually around the top 10 sort of rankings, but had a much lower profile than Manny Pacquiao at that point. But if we go into the actual fight itself, Bradley entered a 7-2 underdog again, so wasn't necessarily favoured bookies wise or in the boxing public either. So it's a case of in the actual fight, I'm going to split it into two halves essentially here. So rounds 0 to 6, I'm looking at it, and probably 6-0 Pacquiao. I mean, the judges actually scored it 4-2, but I mean, Bradley hurt his ankle in round 2, was stunned at the end of round 3, outpunched most of those rounds. I mean, you could probably argue it was a 5-1, but other than that, it was comprehensive. The second half of the fight was a bit different. Bradley said our post-fight, yes, he got his second wind around round 6, started using the double jab a bit more. But again, took a thumb to the eye in round 8. So that was pretty much completely non-competitive in that round, despite on the judges' scorecards winning that round. And it was close. It was a closer fight. But we look at the end of it, it finished 115, 113, 115, 113, 113, 115 in favour of Tim Bradley. And just before I continue with this sort of aftermath of what happened in that fight, I'd just like to share again some punch stats basically. So Manny outlanded Bradley 253 to 159 in total punches landed, 190 to 108 in power shots landed, and outlanded Bradley in 10 of the 12 rounds. But still, as I said, has lost it 7-5 somehow on two of the judges' scorecards. So just to give you an immediate reaction as to what happened, obviously I watched it again and then did a bit of research before we sat down here today, is that obviously there was booing in the audience. Pacquiao was obviously stunned. I think Aaron went crazy, as you'd expect. There was also a journalist who was throwing out the post-fight press conference for interrupting Aaron. I think it was a guy from Fan versus Fan, some media outlet essentially, for essentially accusing him of fixing the fight. The press ringside had it 117, 111 Pacquiao. Howard Lederman had it 119, 109. And even Teddy Atlas God love him, Teddy Atlas, fireman, all that jazz, said that that Pacquiao clearly won the fight, and it was a result either of incompetence or corruption. So, as Paul said, with Lewis and Holyfield, there were 2 rematches following, which Pacquiao won convincingly. Dropped Bradley twice in the second one, won both of them UD. But yeah, I've chosen that fight essentially because I just think at the time it was shocking to see someone lose a decision where they'd of that profile, where they'd outbox their opponent. Even though the cards were quite close, there was still something clearly amiss in the scoring. So I don't know if you lads have any thoughts on that. If you lads have seen that fight, I mean, Paul, you must have been about 14, 15 at that point. You lads watched it at all? Have any thoughts on that one?
I feel like these videos were just like appraising like what age Paul is. I'm actually sick of this. I'm talking about how young Paul is. I've got a few for you, Elliot. So that night, I'm just going to be completely honest with you right away, and you're going to be disappointed in me, but it wasn't my fault. I won money on Bradley that night, but it was nothing to do with.
What did you
get? I'm just getting this out now, Paul, because he's going to give me pelters for this at some point. So I'm just getting out there now. Look back at the fight, Elliot. Do you believe that the judges were scoring a certain style of fight, or do you feel that there was some kind of bias towards Bradley for whatever reason? Because I've watched the fight back, and it is, I had Pacquiao winning.
I would have said that there was bias towards the style, in the sense that you had Bradley started quick, didn't he? He was like on the front foot essentially, and Pacquiao was counter punching for quite a bit of the early rounds. But then I look at it, almost kind of that style kind of switched a bit in the second half. It was almost like Bradley was counter punching, Pacquiao was coming on. So I was kind of sitting there going, I don't know if it is that, or whether it's just simply a case of I don't know shit about boxing. It's simply a case of like when you're sitting there ringside or whatever it is. But I mean, I can't make a case for it just from the eventual punch stats. And this is the way that, I mean, certainly, I mean, obviously it doesn't count as a knockdown, but when you see someone sort of stunned essentially in a round and they still win that round, but then you can sort of see someone essentially lose a round just because they got caught once with like a straight hand or whatever. That sort of thing, I don't know, that sort of thing just doesn't necessarily sit right with me. So I would, in a way, I still think there's something suspicious about it that may not even come out, to be honest with you. I just can't. It was so like, I mean, if you'd have said, I mean, I don't know, I'll go back to you and say how many, I mean, if you can off the top of your head remember how many rounds you'd have given Bradley. I mean, I gave it at best sort of 8-4 sort of territory. So to then give it like 7-5 the other way is a big leap. So to me, I can't really explain it. I still think there's something odd about it that we don't necessarily know, like whether it was engineered, whether it was something to do with the Pacquiao Mayweather, whether it was anything to do with that, I don't know. But yeah, I think it must be at least incompetence rather than the way you're sort of judging the fight style wise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I had it about 8-4 myself. Paul, I don't know if you were in bed for school that night. We might as well just keep this going, shouldn't we? But did you manage to watch that fight back? Do you have any thoughts on it? Do you believe that there was a certain scoring strategic tactic that night from the judges? Or, I mean, were both guys promoted by Top Rank that night? Or is that even something we can bring into the question?
Not 100% sure with that, but yeah, no, I haven't watched it in the last, say, few months or whatever. But you know, it's one of those. If you do go down a list of, 10 or 20 of the worst boxing decisions, it does crop up near the top 5 a good few times. And I think when you're saying about the scoring as well, yeah, I mean, if you were going to be really, really generous, you could give it a 7-5 in favor of Pacquiao, but that's being super generous to Bradley. And even at that, we were talking a 4 or 5 round switch here. I think the thing for me is, I don't know whether, I think I agree with Elliot and what he's saying about there's definitely something, not right, or something a bit odd, and so something was up that we may never find out. But it's just no consistency. I think if you look at that fight, there was no consistency from the judges. As Elliot said, it didn't end up knocking him down, but it's as close as you could come to knocking him down, stunning him, jumping on him, trying to get him out of there. It's the closest you could come to a 10-8 round without awarding it a 10-8 because of the knockdown. Yeah, it goes the other way. And then, yeah, you're looking at, I don't know whether the judges at the time maybe are having an agenda where they're thinking, because they perhaps, I'm not saying the judges wanted Bradley to win, but if they're, they know what side their bread's being buttered on, is what I'm trying to say. If they're watching that fight and Manny Pacquiao lands a 4 or 5 punch combination, but it's not necessarily concussive, yet then, Bradley maybe comes back 30 seconds later and lands a straight 1-2. They're all going, oh yeah, no, that 1-2 was good. Yep, tick for Bradley. He's ticked the boxes. I think it was maybe that. I just don't think it was scored fairly in favour of Pacquiao. But I am glad he obviously went on to avenge the loss. The loss, I should say.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. That's something that I was actually going to come to. 2 things there that you mentioned that are really interesting. Number one is some of these judges reacting to the noise when fighters are throwing shots. The second thing, it's not doing justice to the fights that we've chosen, but I've just came across something that all 3 fights have in common that we've chosen, guys, and that's that justice was done in the rematches. So if we look, Lewis beat Holyfield, Malignaggi beat Diaz, Pacquiao beat Bradley. So it's at least, I suppose, that justice was done. Elliot, can you remind me? I don't know if you I apologise if you touched point on it there. What was the worst judges' scorecard that night in that fight?
They're all 115, 113, but they were just
all 115, 113. Yeah. So I suppose it's a little bit of everything there. But just looking finally back at that fight, is there anything that you have any final thoughts on? Anything that you want to add to the fight that you think the viewers will want to know, anything interesting, etc., that you've not touched point on yet?
I just want to say, really, I suppose, I mean, it was said at the time that Tim Bradley essentially came out at the end of the fight saying he tried hard but couldn't beat him in the ring, literally as it finished. So as long as those things kind of happen, I mean, boxers know, don't they? You can tell by body language, you can tell. I think as long as it kind of keeps happening, I almost feel like these sort of things they'll just disadvantage and sort of deteriorate what boxing could be essentially in the eyes of a lot of people. But like you were saying as well, what I'd like to say, I suppose, as well, is that, I mean, obviously we've seen, like you were saying, these guys have avenged their losses. But do you guys, actually I'll flip around to you, do you guys ever see this changing in boxing? So for example, like for guys that didn't necessarily get the chance to avenge it, like Ryder versus Smith, close fights like that, McKenna versus Mimoun, those close sort of fights where you think, oh, I can kind of understand why it's gone that way because that's the money, that's where it's going. Like we want Canelo versus Smith, for example. I can kind of see how that would happen. But do you think that's ever gonna leave boxing, or do you think that's just so inherent in it that that's just something we have to sort of put up with? And I'm going to come to you first, Greg, and then Paul will give you final word.
Yeah, thanks, mate. I'm going to say no. I don't mean to be negative, but I think it's always going to be based on the promotional company that put the show on. I think if we've seen some more fair scorecards lately. For example, we touched point at the beginning of the video, Bivol Canelo. I think we all kind of thought, you said that Bivol was probably going to need to be dominant to get that fight, but it was the better fighter on the night. It wasn't like a spanking, but it definitely won the fight. It was clear there to see, and the judges scored it that way. So in some ways, I think when it's highlighted, guys, I think there will be fair scoring, but I think you're always going to get your bad decisions here and there, and I think it's just going to be based on politics, promotional companies, based on where states in America are, with the greatest respect. But it's been well regarded. The fight I picked, a fighter from Texas, if someone goes to Texas to fight there, you're already 3 rounds down before the first bell goes. So yeah, for me, to answer your question, I don't see it changing. I see it getting better, but I think it's always going to be there.
Paul, would you agree with Greg there? Do you think there's essentially there's always going to be a cultural thing that's inherent in the sport?
Yeah, I'm afraid I do. I kind of have to agree. It's just upsetting. It's just disappointing. You know yourself when you watch a fight, and yeah, okay, we know sometimes when fights are close, and I know there's this thing of it's what you like, but in my opinion, like, it's not really like, why should there be it's what you like? See, if you had a universal scoring criteria for over the whole of boxing, whereas right, this counts towards the rounds. This guy's going to win a 10-9 round if he's more on the front foot, he lands more jabs, blah blah blah. Not this. Sometimes I think counter punchers don't get the credit, in the sense that if someone's walking forward, not landing, or landed on just arms and gloves, yet the counter puncher is moving out of range, landing 2 or 3 shots of his own, but it looks like he's walking away because he's on the back foot. I don't think that's fair to say, oh yeah, I scored it to him because he was pressing the fight and he was coming forward. I do get it in a sense, but not when you're landing on gloves and arms in it every time. And just the final thought I would say is, like, I don't think we'll ever really see it drastically improve to it being almost perfect unless you have almost one worldwide boxing commission, which is just never going to happen because there's too much money in the individual commissions and stuff like that. And I don't want to go into that, but yeah, I think that to answer your question, no, I don't really see it changing 100%, although I do hope that it does gradually get better and better.
Thank you very much, guys. Well, 3 fantastic fights there, 3 fantastic summaries. Thank you, obviously, guys, for watching. Let us know in the comments whether you agree, whether you have any other recommendations for other fights that you think were more outrageous than the ones we've selected. But we hope you enjoyed the video, and yeah, stay tuned for more content. Paul and Greg, been a pleasure as always. Hopefully see you guys soon, and thank you again, guys, for watching.